Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. This must be the Encryption 24 hours, because I think there were 3 workshops, so apologies to those of you who've seen me yesterday. You can check whether I'm still on message today. I think it's an extremely timely occasion to have this discussion, because indeed the European Commission will tomorrow adopt its digital strategy, which will really set out the way forward on digital issues for the mandate to come, and the Parliament will be discussing this starting, I think, already on Thursday. So this is really the time at which we need to have these discussions, and I really welcome the occasion to discuss this with you today, and I'm the only thing standing between you and the discussion, so I'm trying to be short. The bad news is that the speakers before me raised so many ideas that my speech kept getting longer because I want to respond to them all. The good news is that they also mentioned a lot of things that I would have said or wanted to say in my speech. And I think the perspective that thus far has not been represented in as much detail as the perspective of the victims of crime and the perspective of the issues that law enforcement faces with encryption. So I'm going to focus slightly more on that, but I remind you that the European Commission is not on either side. We're here as experts to support the co-legislators in coming up with the right policy on these issues. So I want to first of all specify what I will talk about. In the program it says that encryption and data protection pose challenges for law enforcement. We do not see data protection as a challenge for law enforcement. We see it as a necessary mechanism to create the right safeguards and accountability for how we process data. So what I will focus on is the use of encryption by criminals. We strongly support the use of robust encryption. It has great value in ensuring cybersecurity and in making sure that our data and our communications remain private. I use it daily, professionally and privately, as I'm sure do all of you. But as the technology continues to develop, we see an industry shift to increasingly include encryption features by default in products, making it readily available for free in many situations where we haven't used it previously. And unfortunately, that has also created more space by criminals to create lawless spaces where they can plan and execute criminal activities without fear of reprisal. Now, I want to maybe not just focus on law enforcement, also mention the role of the companies here. So the companies that implement this include, just to pick one example, Facebook, who has announced plans to implement end-to-end encryption on its Messenger platform, which is one of the most commonly used platforms today for the exchange of messages. And I'm sure you all use it daily. Now, as you might not be aware, Facebook has been scanning its Messenger platform for known child sexual abuse images. It has been doing so for 9 years. This has not created any issues in the past. It has been transparent about it, and there are no cases that are reported of abuse of this technology, which is called PhotoDNA, for other illicit purposes, such as the ones that were mentioned before. Now, just in the year 2018, this scanning mechanism found 12 million images of child sexual abuse, and this is serious child sexual abuse, these are not borderline cases, on Facebook Messenger alone that were reported to the central platform for this in the United States, NECMEC. 800,000 of those images were uploaded by people in the European Union, and there are specific cases that were solved because of those reports. To cite just a few, in 2016, there was a case in Sweden where a notification from NECMEC that was received from Facebook Messenger led to the rescue of 11 victims of child sexual abuse that was being committed in Sweden. In 2018, 100 victims were identified in France, also thanks to a notification from Facebook Messenger. And in 2019, there was a case in Germany, a particularly heinous case of abuse where 2 victims were rescued from a family. And I don't want to go into the details of the investigations. These are just 3 of many, many more cases. But when Facebook moves to end-to-end encryption on the Messenger platform, it has not yet found an answer to how it would deal with detecting these cases of abuse. And this is not just an illegal image, there's a victim behind it. So it's extremely important that we find a solution for this going forward. Also in other situations, it has severely crippled law enforcement access to electronic evidence and makes it harder to understand what criminals are plotting. And again, this is not a question of following a guy in a bar. With the internet, we've created a system where everybody can reach out to anyone at any given point in time. There is no replacement to digital investigations. And member states have on several occasions raised the alarm on this issue, noting that as many as 90% of cases where you have investigations into serious and organized crime require or are hampered by encryption one way or another. Another risk that I want to highlight is that we see increasing fragmentation as member states left to their own devices take their own approaches. Some of them were already highlighted here. We don't necessarily agree with all of them, but we're also at the moment not providing better solutions. The member states have called on us to provide better solutions. The JHA Ministerial issued a declaration, and also the European Council highlighted the issues that were faced in terrorist investigations following the Bataclan attacks that arose from encryption. So the Commission has taken a more structured approach to this and has focused, to start out with, on encryption on devices, and has issued a number of has actually issued a communication in early 2018 proposing a number of measures that should be undertaken and that are already being implemented. I just want to go through them quickly. More information is available. The first of those is that at the Joint Research Center in ISPRA, we have created a decryption facility. So where law enforcement agencies have issues in accessing an encrypted device, they can make use of this decryption facility to support their investigation. Of course, that is subject to a very strict framework of safeguards and accountability, including transparency measures. As a second measure, we have also provided training for law enforcement. Here I fully echo what Patrick has already said before, that the answer is not just to throw technology at the problem and to call for decryption all over the place, but rather to make sure that law enforcement is skilled enough to be able to deal with the problem in all of its complexity. So they have to make the right use of the right tools. They have to be aware of other investigative methodologies, and where needed, they have to make use of the right use of the decryption tools available. The third measure that we have proposed is to create a network of experts between law enforcement agencies to exchange best practices, but also to exchange information on the challenges that they face, and that is being run by Europol. The fourth measure I want to mention to you is a toolbox that we have also created at Europol, where law enforcement can share specific tools for online investigations related to overcoming encryption challenges. And the fifth measure I want to mention here today is an Observatory Report, which I think is really helpful to inform the discussion. This is a document compiled by Europol and Eurojust that updates policymakers on the latest challenges that encryption poses, but also on the tools that are available, on the legislative approaches in member states and elsewhere, and also on latest judicial developments. So just to highlight the current issue, which is out today, you can find it on the Eurojust and soon hopefully also the Europol website. That is available for your information. And finally, Patrick, I think the Fundamental Rights Agency must have intercepted your communications because they are already working on a handbook on cybercrime, which will also deal with the challenges of encryption. And in fact, they haven't yet advanced further on this work because they're waiting for the adoption of the evidence proposals, because they don't think they could do a proper job on the whole thing without covering those as well. So there, of course, the ball is in the court of the Parliament to develop its position. So having said that about what the Commission does, I just want to close by saying a couple things about the discussion going forward, both today and even more importantly for the mandate of the Commission to come. And I want to suggest that there might be 4 principles that we want to look at in this discussion. First of all, we need to break down the problem. It's not useful to just talk about encryption, because there are many different forms of encryption. There is encryption of the transport layer in mobile telecommunications. There is end-to-end encryption on applications. There is encryption of devices. And you really need to look at all of these issues in turn to have a specific and helpful conversation on them. Second principle related to that is that there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to solutions either. You cannot take a solution that works for end-to-end encryption and just employ it on a device. That's not workable, and that also wouldn't be fit because the solutions need to be proportionate to the challenge. The third principle that I want to posit is that the solution is not always decryption or breaking encryption. The solution has to be targeted in how it progresses, and that includes other techniques. Maximilian was referring to the need to access metadata, for example. There are situations where you can tell a lot from the metadata, where you do not need to access the communication. So that is also an approach that we need to stimulate But at the same time, there will be cases where we cannot avoid tackling the problem itself, where that problem, encryption of a communication between criminals or encryption of content that proves evidence of crime or that depicts a victim, is necessary to actually advance in the case. And the fourth principle that I want to highlight is the need for targeted safeguards, because only when we break down the problems and identify the right solutions for each part of the problem can we look at the right safeguards to employ. And that, I think, is the key challenge ahead of the legislator. Commissioner Breton highlighted that also in his intervention at the security conference, where he had a discussion with Facebook and basically said it is not for the companies to set the policy on this. It is really for the co-legislators to be looking at this. And that's the big challenge ahead of the Commission and the Parliament and the Council in this. And Birgitta mentioned that at some point she found herself being the only one who understands anything on that topic. And while I agree with her that there's a lot more people who understand bits and pieces, we still haven't arrived at the level of sophistication that would be needed in this discussion to really make good policy. And I think that's where conversations like the one today really play a large role in educating the policymakers and in making sure that we all have a sufficient understanding to be able to make the right recommendations on how to move forward. So I really look forward to further discussing this, both with the worst possible dictators in mind, but also with the victims of crime in mind, and just to remember that there's vulnerable populations on both sides of the equation. So I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussion.